the book, as you see here, it's called A Mind Hacker's Guide to Shifting into Brain 3.0. And the way I define mind hacking is using science to enhance the best qualities of being human by proactively steering brain development in a way that physiologically supports greater physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual well-being, alignment, and integration. How does that sound to you? How many of you want to experience that? Raise your hand. Right, so it sounds like this is pretty universal, and knowing how the science of the brain affects you will help you live a much more enjoyable and productive, happy life. So first I want to explain, why did I become a mind hacker? And it wasn't necessarily a positive story in the sense that I really needed it to survive. I grew up in this takeout restaurant pictured here in West Oak Lane. My parents took it over when I was about 8 years old, started working right away, and gangs used to come in, fight each other, rob people. When I was in middle school, one of our customers was shot in the head leaving the store. So I had a lot of trauma that I suppressed, and I was academically gifted, and I got into Harvard. So for most people, that's like, oh my God, it sounds like a happy fairy tale come true. But it wasn't a fairy tale ending. When I got to Harvard, all I really experienced was culture shock. To go from the inner city to that type of environment of privilege, affluence, and elitism, it was very exclusive. And when I shared my stories with my classmates, people's jaws would drop. They would want to call DHS or Child Protective Services on my parents. I mean, people didn't understand my background, so I began to stop sharing. And when I heard about my classmates' background, about summer vacations in Europe, summer houses on the beach, I was like, whoa, how do you live that way? And it was very hard to find people who understood me or resonated with me, and I felt more and more isolated at Harvard. And because I didn't have a social support network, and I didn't know how to handle stress, I didn't have coping mechanisms, my PTSD symptoms finally blew up. And I didn't know how to cope with those either. I had dissociations, flashbacks, nightmares. I kept worrying about my parents and whether they were safe back in Philadelphia. I kept feeling guilty, and yet I felt ashamed of the background I came from and the stigma of being poor, and then the stigma of mental health. And I just kind of hid everything because I didn't want anyone to know that was going on with me. So I withdrew further and further, and finally I was having panic attacks I couldn't control, symptoms that made me feel suicidal constantly, and finally I decided to get help. And so when I went to see the university psychiatrist, he asked me to walk him through my life story. So I explained, my parents escaped from Vietnam when I was 6 months old. I spent the first year and a half of my life, barely surviving. I nearly died several times when the boat ran out of food and water. And then when we got to the refugee camps, there was so much disease. There was not a lot of good nutrition. So I nearly died of several different diseases. And finally, I survived that, and we made it to inner city Philadelphia, where we were resettled. And first, my parents were really happy, along with other refugees, until they realized they weren't really wanted. People called us all sorts of names. Even as a child, I've been called every single name you could call a refugee or an Asian person. And it was a violent time. We were settled in Logan. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Logan. It's a very violent area of the city. People get shot walking to and from school. It's not uncommon. And so we learned to be street smart and to take care of ourselves. And then, I got into Central High School. My parents always said education was your way out. So I managed to graduate at the top of Central High School by not dealing with my trauma, right? Just pushing through it, doing what I needed to do, and not thinking too much about what I had experienced. And so when I finished my story, the psychiatrist was like, have you any idea that what you went through would shape your brain? And I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, especially the time before you were 2, when you barely survived that period. And I was totally confused. I was like, but I have no memory of it, so why should it matter? And he said, no, the research now shows any trauma you experience before you were 2 actually shapes your personality, it shapes your brain development. And now that you're becoming an adult, all of that is manifesting. On top of that, you experience much more trauma growing up. And so all that, can be contributing to what you're feeling, you're experiencing. And I was like, wow, I had no idea, and I felt both relief and devastation, because what he explained was that there was no cure for PTSD at that time. They recommended taking antidepressants, and I had to cycle through different ones at different doses to find the one that worked for me, and he recommended therapy. But therapists didn't really understand how to treat trauma back in the late 90s. And so I decided to follow what he shared. It made me feel less bad, but it didn't really make me feel good. And I realized I would have to take it upon myself to heal and to come back to the type of life I wanted to live. And so based on what I learned about the brain from the psychiatrist, what I learned about my mental habits from the therapist, I realized how I was using my brain was making it worse. It was up to me to learn more about neuroscience, to learn how to use my brain in a way that would help it heal. And so I had so many negative patterns. I didn't know how to cope with stress. I would make the stress worse. I would escalate conflict and tension. And I learned to let go of a lot of things and listen to the voice in my head, and realized that it was saying horrible things. And I had to learn to change the way I use my brain so I could talk to an inner coach instead of an inner critic, right? And over time, by teaching myself mind hacking techniques, by getting better sleep, exercising, quitting junk food, not pulling all-nighters, things like that, my brain did get much better. I stopped doing things that made it worse, and then I did manage to graduate with honors. And I had a deadline to find a way to heal myself, because after graduation, I knew I was going to lose health insurance. So I wouldn't be able to afford medication and therapy. And so I had to rely on the mind hacking techniques going forward. So I got off the medication, I got off the therapy, and I just helped myself practice the things that made my brain healthy. And luckily, I never had another relapse of PTSD. So in the end, I managed to do well for myself. I got into management consulting, private equity investments. I went to Wharton Business School. I paid off all my debt. And I realized throughout that time, I never stopped having this other part of me that, my parents still live in the inner city. My cousins, my extended relatives are still pretty poor, right? And so my life totally involves bridging the socioeconomic divide. And it's hard. It was hard to do it as a teenager. It hasn't really gotten easier to do it as an adult. On September 20th, this fall, there was a 3-way gun battle where my parents live. 40 bullets were fired. One man was hospitalized. And the police sealed off the house. No one could leave or come out or come in. And then, on October 15th, a few months ago, just last month, there was a drive-by shooting, over 12 bullets fired at like 11:30 in the morning. One of our neighbors was killed, 2 blocks away from my house. So it's really, really hard. However, without the calm clarity techniques, I don't think I'd be able to handle it. I don't think I'd be able to stay sane. So I tell people I'm probably the #1 beneficiary of calm clarity, because it allows me to still make a positive impact on the world, no matter how much negativity is happening around me. Does that resonate with you guys? How many of you feel like you're often surrounded by negativity and you feel overwhelmed, right? And so the key is to trust that there's a part of us that can be a light in the darkness. And even given all the tragedy I have to go through, I'm still able to work with executives. Like you see this cover of the Wharton magazine. I do this training for CEOs, for boards, for elite organizations. So the same thing we teach for inner city students also resonates for executives, because everyone has to deal with stress. Everyone has a brain that is sensitive to negativity and fear and being overwhelmed. We all have to learn how to use our brains more effectively. Does that resonate with you guys? So my hope is this is not just something that's going to make you feel good for 1 day or 2 days, that this is going to change the way you think about life and the way you handle frustration and negativity and fear and stress and anxiety. and hopefully get you on a path where you'll develop healthy mechanisms for handling your own self-talk, your own the voice in your head, and learn how to change the way you relate to yourself, and see that you are strong and you bring so many gifts that this world needs you to contribute to make it a better place. So I hope that resonates and that inspires you to really pay attention today. And with every type of training, what you put into it affects what you get out of it. So it's really up to you to see this as a space for you to learn, to experiment, to connect with people, because often it's that group sharing that makes a huge difference. Being able to share your experiences with people here who are creating space to hear you, to be compassionate, to have empathy, to see you, to hear you. I mean, that's very powerful. So I hope that we can give that gift to each other. So I want to ask everyone to set an intention to create a safe space here for dialogue, for understanding, to not judge each other, but to really try to appreciate and accept everything that we bring to the table.